late-night jam session at the Old Mutual Musicians Hall. The cradle of jazz. And the cradle still rocks in this old building. The walls have heard all the jazz legends play here. This place oozes history. The story of Kansas City and all that jazz. The music has echoed through Kansas City for almost 100 years. Once the headquarters of Musicians Union 627, this building is now a National Historic Landmark, celebrating the jazz stars that came through these doors. Count Basie, Charlie Parker, and scores of other musicians who went on to spread the Kansas City sound around the world. They say the history of jazz was built on 4 pillars: New Orleans, Kansas City, New York, and Chicago. Each played a role in what became an original American art form, but Kansas City's role was unique.
I think it's crucial. It's a linchpin. Probably after New Orleans, number 2 to me. Jazz was born in New Orleans, but it grew up in Kansas City.
To understand how this music developed, you have to look to the history of Kansas City. In the early 20th century, Kansas City was known as a wide-open town, a town where anything goes.
There was gambling throughout the city, there was prostitution, and the very shadow of City Hall.
And overseeing it all was political boss Tom Pendergast, who controlled City Hall, the police department, and almost everything else in town. Under his protection, clubs and bars regularly ignored liquor and gambling laws, and almost any other law that would get in the way of keeping the party going and making money. Many of the club owners had political connections to Pendergast and connections with the mob.
Kansas City was a 24-hour town. The bars never closed. There was gambling out north of the river where there was a racetrack out by Riverside. One-armed bandits were as common as soda fountains and drug stores. 12th Street stretched a mile west. It was an early version of Las Vegas.
When pianist Mary Lou Williams arrived in Kansas City, she proclaimed it a heavenly place.
Music everywhere. 50 or more cabarets rocking on 12th and 18th Streets. Most of the night spots were run by politicians and hoodlums, and the town was wide open for drinking, gambling, and pretty much every form of vice. Naturally, work was plentiful for musicians. Mary Lou Williams, pianist and arranger.
And there was no better example of that idea of flaunting the law than a place called the State Line Club, where the state line was painted right down the middle of the club.
The dance floor was on the Kansas side, and the bar and the gambling was on Missouri. And if police raided from Kansas, everybody could step over to the Missouri side and vice versa.
We were very fertile then, the territory bands. And again, you know, during that time, Kansas City was an open town. You know, during Prohibition, they call it the Paris of the Plains.
That title wasn't always meant as a compliment.
If you want to see some sin, forget Paris and go to Kansas City. With the possible exception of such renowned centers as Singapore and Port Said, Kansas City has the greatest sin industry in the world. Edward Murrow, Omaha World Herald.
What this atmosphere also brought with it was music. Lots of music.
I've got a gal lives up on that hill. Well, they both try to quit me, Lord, but
worried about the state closing laws. Many clubs stayed open all day and all night, never closing. Almost all of them featured music, everything from lone piano to full-size bands.
There was work for musicians from the Southwest territories, Texas and Oklahoma primarily. So musicians flocked to Kansas City where they could work in the clubs, and also there were a number of ballrooms, including the Playmore and the El Torreon. And they provided steady work for musicians.
It was also a time of segregation, a time when there was a definite separation of the races.
They were accustomed to never going too far outside of the invisible boundary that sort of defined the community.
That boundary created a need to provide for their own services, their own businesses, and around the Jazz District, a thriving African-American community grew. A city within a city.
On both sides of the streets, there was nothing but just, businesses, restaurants, and things like that.
40,000 people in 3 square miles. A different situation from Harlem, a different situation from Chicago, a different situation. And then the biggest difference of all was Boston Pendergast. That we were in other parts of the country, there was a depression. And in Kansas City, it was wide open, money, things like that. So people were coming here. So Local 627 facilitated all of that history.
When band leader Andy Kirk got here, he was amazed.
Blacks in the school systems, in business, in the professions, it was a revelation to me. Kansas City was a regular mecca for young blacks from other parts of the country aspiring to higher things. They had their own theaters and all types of black entertainment, their own clubs, ballrooms, bars and grills, their own homes and residential areas, and their own newspaper. In short, blacks in Kansas City had their own everything, even their own baseball team, the Monarchs. Andy Kirk, band leader.
So much of that had to do with political aspects, of course. There were segregated situations all over the country. But the city within a city was that big. You went to the hairdresser that daughter was your teacher. You went to the nightclub who's might have a brother who was a pastor of the church that was right next to the club. That compactness, that closeness of a community, bred this whole situation. So you had that generation, that generating of money passing hands back and forth within one community.
That was the world where Musicians Union 627 was born. Founded in 1917, it began with just 25 members, but quickly began to grow. It operated as a clearinghouse for engagements and grievances about working conditions. And in contrast to the segregation of the times, they were able to work out an affiliation with the National Musicians Union that gave them the same rights as their white counterparts. Those social and political ingredients blended with the music to provide the perfect melting pot for a different kind of sound.
The community shaped the music, that the community bought out what will become swing. The dance halls, the ability for there to be money to be made as a musician, that there was a musicians union, that there was enforcement of those things. You've got musicians, even though they were living all in a segregated situation, even those who were considered to be, international artists, Cab Calloway, and all of those guys still had to come to the community. So I say this community definitely shaped what was going to become jazz in a different way from anybody else.
The community, the union, and the music all grew together.
Around 1920, just after the turn of the century, the nation becomes dance crazy.
New dance clubs opened, record sales took off, and so did the new phenomenon called radio.
Bill Abernathy speaking in behalf of the Blue Network, inviting you now to listen to a brand new dance orchestra.
Radio stations made Kansas City a beacon of jazz.
It wasn't like today, where radio stations filled the dial. And sometimes that brought them vast audiences.
And in those days, there weren't that many radio stations in the country, and there wasn't that much in the ether that we have today with all these microwaves and all that. So these radio broadcasts would carry great distances. You could pick up the broadcasts from Maine to Hawaii.
Have you heard the very latest news all about the very latest blues?
A few enterprising Kansas City radio stations began broadcasting bands live. The first was a white band, led by Carlton Coon and Joe Sanders, playing at the Hotel Mulebach.
When Coon and Sanders start to play those Nighthawk blues, you start to sway.
In their own version of social networking, they used the telegraph to stay in touch with their listeners.
Tune right in on the radio, grab a telegram and say hello.
The first night they broadcast, the microphone was left on, and Leo Fitzpatrick, the announcer, mentioned you'd have to be a Nighthawk to stay up and listen to the late night broadcast. And they received something like 3,000 telegrams, which is an early form of email, of course, that they were indeed Nighthawks. So what they did is they formed a fan club, and individuals from all over the country would send telegrams saying, we want to join the fan club, sign us up, or we want to dedicate this, and they would read those on the air. And so it became immensely popular.
Within a week, they had 5,000 responses from listeners in 31 states. They quickly changed the band's name to the Nighthawks.
From coast to coast and back again, you can hear that syncopated rain. It's there, you declare. Listen to the Nighthawk blues, tune in, listen to the Nighthawk blues.
By the next year, Benny Moten's band was on the air, the first African-American band to be broadcasting from Kansas City. It too was immensely popular. Always a good businessman, Moten quickly renamed his band Benny Moten's Radio Orchestra.
It happened that way, and somebody heard it. The radio, the new medium, oh, what's that? That's Kansas City sound. So it was an organic thing that happened.
And the recording industry took off too, with Kansas City bands going to Chicago or East Coast studios to record several songs in a day-long marathon session. In a 1999 interview, band leader Jay McShann recalled it was a bare-bones operation in those days.
And they did put up one mic in front of the whole big band. One little mic in front of the whole big band. And that's what we recorded. Yeah, well, the goal is we got a hit out of it, It was a hit.
Record sales reached a record high of 104 million in 1927. Under the Pendergast regime, even the Depression didn't have much effect. The Kansas City music scene kept growing. By 1929, Local 627 had outgrown its old offices, and the union bought an apartment building in the 1800 block of Highland. It's the same building that is still the home of the Musicians Foundation. The union paid for remodeling with what would become an annual event, the Musicians Ball. Fans packed Paseo Hall.
The crowd did everything but hang on the ceiling. The lobby was jammed, the dance floor was jammed, the seats along the wall were jammed, and the balcony was groaning with too much population. The Kansas City Call.
Benny Moten's orchestra was one of 6 bands to perform. Moten had been one of the union's founders and one of the dominant bands in the city. And about that time, a young piano player named Bill Basie joined the band.
Even musicians that came from New York, when Count Basie first came here, he stumbled upon 18th and Vine. He said it was there's like, boom, Klieg lights. It was just happening. He couldn't believe it. He had never seen anything like it, and he was coming from Harlem.
Dance halls had gotten larger and larger, some with room for 2,000 to 3,000 dancers on the floor. Benny Moten and other bands began to develop a unique sound. Instead of the traditional 2/4 time, They were going to 4/4, meaning instead of counting 2 beats to a measure, they were doing 4.
If you're playing a march, it's going to be like boo-doo-doo-doo-dee, ba-doo-doo-doo-dee, ba-ba-doo-doo-doo-dee, da-doo-doo-dee. But now if you're going to play a jazz type tune, say a Charlie Parker tune, now's the time. Do-dee-dee, bow-dow-bow-dee, be-doo-dee-doo-dee, ba-boo-doo-doo-doo-dee, da. That's a 2 and 4. A 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, boom, ba-boom, boom, boom, boom. And your march is more on 1 and 3, which comes from New Orleans. But you play jazz, all of a sudden you should be clapping on 2 and 4. As a matter of fact, there's a T-shirt that said, "Friends don't let friends clap on 1 and 3."
In many ways, it was revolutionary. It was the beginning of the Kansas City sound, the beginning of swing.
Swing, the word swing started here. The first time they used that was Moton swing. The word swing, the four beats to a bar with the bass, the walking bass.
As that sound developed, Bill Basie had ideas, and he found the perfect partner.
Basie couldn't read music, but Eddie Durham, who played guitar and trombone with the band, was a great arranger. And so Basie would tell him his musical ideas, and Eddie Durham would articulate those ideas, and they would take them to Benny, and Benny would pick up on them and he would record them. You can hear in the recordings how Durham and Basie really developed Kansas City jazz style.
How Count Basie got his name and his band, Kansas City and All That Jazz continues. In the late 20s, Kansas City became a prime stop for the national bands from the East. Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong,
Every night while I shake my back, cut my dynamite, change my mind,
The audiences at the dance halls were still segregated, but bands could play for both. Often a band would play for a white audience one night and then move to a different hall to play for an African American audience the next. Exposure to the Eastern bands started Kansas City band leaders thinking, and they started setting their sights on dates in larger cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, and their union card paved the way.
That card was their ticket to out of the city when they wanted to play out of the city, to play any place they could in the Midwest. And if they were going to New York, they would, like early on, Benny Moten goes to New York, they're members of this local, and that was honored by the local in New York.
In 1931, Benny Moten's band started a cross-country tour that had them hopscotching their way toward the East Coast, eventually landing in the Savoy Ballroom in New York. New York audiences seemed to love the band. In an article in the Kansas City Call, Moten talked about the musicians' reaction.
They had heard so much about the good bands around New York that they weren't at all certain that they could measure up to the pace set by the big fellows. Then they went east and all. The folks out there were kind enough to give the band a great big hand wherever it went. That treatment gave the fellows confidence. They felt now that they were in a class with the best of them. Benny Moten has told to the Kansas City Call.
But eventually, after a dispute over bookings, the members voted Moten out of his own band. Bill Basie took over, and in the process, gave himself a new name.
Bill Basie became Count Basie in 1933 after he and Walter Page kicked Benny Moten out of his band. In the Kansas City Call, there's an article, and it says, the Count Basie, and that's the first reference. And he created that name himself. Of course, you had Duke Ellington, Count Basie.
But Basie's lack of experience showed. Unable to get enough bookings, the band failed. Meanwhile, Moten had formed a new band, and Basie was left to try to restart his career.
So he went down to Arkansas and then came back up and worked his way into the good graces of Benny Moten and rejoined the Benny Moten Band. And Moten let him back in.
Basie went back to doing arrangements with Eddie Durham for the Moten Band. Then tragedy struck.
If Benny hadn't died, there's some question as to whether Basie would have emerged as a band leader. In April of 1935, Benny Moten is preparing to go back to New York. And the band's playing in Denver at the Rainbow Room, and Benny Moten stayed behind in Kansas City to have his tonsils removed because he'd had trouble with his tonsils. And the doctor who operated was a dear friend of his, and the rumor was that they'd been out drinking and the doctor's hand slipped. But according to Ed Lewis, the trumpeter with the group, Benny Moten did not like anesthetics, so he took a local for this operation, and he felt the surgeon's hand and he moved, and it cut his artery, and he bled to death on the operating table.
The news hit Kansas City like a bomb. A star was gone.
It was the largest funeral Kansas City had witnessed in 20 years. Thousands of both races, from all walks of life, filled every space available and overflowed far out into the streets during the last rites for Benny Moten, the Kansas City Call.
With Benny gone, the other members of the band drifted away. Count Basie put together his own band and took up residence in the Reno Club. Once again, radio helped shape the band's future. Legend has it that promoter John Hammond heard a broadcast on his car radio in Chicago and decided he had to see the Basie Band live. Hammond came to Kansas City and signed Basie to a contract. Hammond brought Basie to New York, setting up club dates and recording sessions. Benny Goodman, then one of the most popular band leaders in the country, made it clear he was a fan.
In my opinion, there's nothing like the pure swing this outfit has, from the moment it starts playing until it stops. Benny Goodman.
That's it, everybody. Now here's a boogie-woogie, solid beat. Come on, you dancers, on your feet.
Basie and his band became one of the nation's favorites, and Count Basie was a star until his death in 1984. Larry Ridley was a bass player with the big bands in their later years, playing with everyone from Ellington to Basie. He recalled what it was like with the Count.
His concept of accompanying was so beautiful, and it gave the soloist the ability to just kind of float above that. And he was very judicious from his own personal style in knowing how to accompany you. And playing with him and the groove that he got was just fantastic. And so as a bass player, all you had to do was just get in there and pat your foot together and just lock up with him. And it was like a cushion, like being on a pallet.
Oh, man. Oh, yeah. And the sound, when you hear the band, it was like a wall of sound, you know? And it wasn't that it was loud, it was just unified. It would just hit you. Like, whoa.
He was the one that reinvigorated swing with the Kansas City style that he pioneered. Swing had become kind of cliched when he hit the scene in 1937, and he reinvigorated it. And he became one of the biggest, most successful band leaders of his generation, and it continued up through his death.
What a gentleman. What a showman. He, after Benny Moten died, of course, he took over the band. And for years and years and years, Count Basie became synonymous with swing. He was everything. Even with the big bands in New York and things, everybody bowed down to the Count.
Around 1929, pianist Mary Lou Williams arrived in Kansas City from Memphis and became a star. But it took a little help from fate. Her husband had taken a job with the Andy Kirk Band, and she followed thinking she would join too. But the other musicians didn't want a woman in the band. That is, until they had an emergency.
Andy Kirk was slated to record, and the pianist, for some reason, didn't show up for the audition. And so Andy asked Mary Williams, as she was known then, she didn't get her name Mary Lou until later, if she would sit in on the session. She said, sure. And she'd been traveling with the band, and she was so gifted, she could just sit in and no one would know the difference. Well, she sat in for the audition, and so when it came time for them to record, Jack Kapp said, hey, where's Mary?
Once she became a full-time member, she also became one of their principal arrangers.
She was a forerunner for the female musician in jazz because most of the doors were closed to them at that time.
After she left the Kirk Band, she went on to perform and write music for a long list of jazz stars: Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Dizzy Gillespie, and mentored dozens of young musicians along the way.
Mary Lou Williams was the most brilliant pianist of her generation. And she's also a bridge in jazz in general between ragtime tradition and bebop. She came to Kansas City in 1929 with Andy Kirk, became a member of the group, toured all across the country, became disillusioned with the band, and then started playing with her own ensemble. Very few women led bands at that time. And then went to New York City, where she lived in the Cecil Hotel, where bebop was brewing at Minton's, which was in the same hotel. And she mentored along young Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, taught them music. And she was always on the cutting edge of all music styles, the evolution of music.
Well, she called me once, years and years ago, and I didn't know why she called me. But after it was over, I realized she was lamenting the fact that rock and roll had come along and that jazz was losing its footing. And what did I think of that? Marvelous piano player. As a matter of fact, I use a picture of her when we do our school concerts because kids ask, do women play jazz?
She could do it all: performing, arranging, composing.
Innovation before anyone understood what innovation was. Feminism before anyone understood the importance of that. Talent, intimidating even by men. And a dedication to who she was as an arranger, composer, singer, talent that was unequaled with the guys because she had to show them twice.
The story about how an incident on a farmer's road gave Charlie Parker his nickname, When Kansas City and All That Jazz, continues. In 1936, just as Count Basie was moving to New York, a new young piano player arrived in town. Jay McShann was on his way to visit an uncle in Omaha, and he had a 2-hour bus layover in Kansas City.
So he went over to the Reno Club because he'd heard those broadcasts, and he wanted to hear the Basie Band. Well, the Basie Band had already gone east, and Billy Hadnot, the bassist, with the Bus Moten Band that was there at that time, said, you don't want to go to Omaha, there's nothing happening up here, it's all happening in Kansas City.
McShann stayed, and that chance layover changed his life.
Jay McShann was the last big African-American band to come out of Kansas City. And he really modeled his style after Basie. Of course, Basie influence was pervasive nationally after he hit with Jumping at the Woodside. It's a 1 o'clock jump.
He filled in and played with small groups until he had a chance to form a band. He had landed a job on the plaza where he started drawing more attention.
Jay McShann and his Barrelhouse Tempos are attracting patronage to Claire Martin's Tavern on the Country Club Plaza. McShann, only 21 years old, plays the finest swing piano in the Middle West. Dexter, Kansas City Journal-Post.
He could command the entire keyboard, not just in a certain section. Sometimes some pianists just played in the middle and they didn't get nowhere else.
Adding to the music was McShann's personality, easygoing with a quick laugh. He made friends quickly and easily.
Everybody's friend.
One of the nicest people you'll ever meet.
Happy, uplifting. You know, I think that's Midwest. We're happy, uplifting in our way, you know. And he had that. He just light up your soul when he played.
The McShann Band was gaining in popularity. And then he added a young saxophone player named Charlie Parker.
Jay McShann's band was well known all throughout the region, all throughout the nation. So for this young cat to be traveling with somebody so big, so fast, and then finding his own voice, but he first found that voice in Jay McShann's band.
Charlie Parker, like a lot of Kansas City musicians, got his start in the Lincoln High School music program. His mother bought him an old saxophone, and it soon was his passion. He dropped out of school to become a musician. Then, just like now, musicians would meet after hours to jam, sometimes a rough and tumble contest to test their skill. Then, just like now, there were some simple rules about taking the stage.
You got to know what you're doing. You come in and you're faking, we're going to rat you out, you know.
Those were the same rules when, at the age of 15, Charlie Parker decided to join in.
So one night he decided he was going to sit in on the jam session. He's still in high school. And he faltered while playing Honeysuckle Rose, and Joe Jones, the drummer, threw a cymbal at his feet.
Threw the cymbal out on the floor as though to say, kid, get out of here. You know, you don't even know what song we're playing.
And Charlie was humiliated, and so he retreated into his mother's home, and he began to do what they call woodshedding, practicing. And he practiced diligently, and that humiliation really shaped him as a musician. He would never get caught in that situation again for the rest of his life.
Parker went on to play with small bands around town, getting more and more experience until he was hired by McShann for his band.
Jay really liked the way Bird played, so when Jay McShann got the gig at Martin's, which he was the one that broke the color barrier on the Country Club Plaza, paid very well, not only with their salaries, but also with tips. And so he brought Bird into the band when Bird was 18 years old.
Things began to change in Kansas City in 1939. After years of investigation, Tom Pendergast pled guilty to tax evasion charges and was sentenced to a year in prison. His political machine crumbled, and so did the protections for the clubs that ignored the state closing laws and fronted gambling operations. Some jobs were drying up, and bands were looking more and more for jobs outside of Kansas City. In a 1999 interview, Jay McShann remembered how it was on one of those road trips that Charlie Parker got his nickname.
You know, as you drive along the country roads, you remember how farmers' chickens used to run out at automobiles when automobiles pass? Sure. You'd be running, the old farmer's chicken would be up here in the yard running in the farm. So these guys, the car Bird driving in, one of the chickens ran out there too far and got hit. And Bird looked back and said, "Hey man, you just hit this yard bird." He said, "Back up, let's pick up and get that yard bird. Ain't no leaving him there." So this guy backed up. Charlie Parker got out of the car, got the yard bird, and put him in the car. You know, we couldn't stay in hotels then, you know. We had to stay at private homes. So he walked in there and he told us, "Miss Josie, I want a room." He said, "But look here, I want to ask you something." He said, "We killed this yard bird coming up here, and could you put this yard bird for me?" She said, "Yeah, I'll be glad to fix it." So she fixed the yard bird for Bird and gave him a room. Bird wouldn't let nobody have none of that yard bird. Yeah. He said, if I had to pick this yard bird up, he said, it wouldn't have been no yard bird. He said, ain't none of you gonna get none of it. And that's how we start calling him yard bird.
Parker was already experimenting, trying chords and harmonies that only he was hearing. Sometimes even his other bandmates couldn't hear it.
A lot of people say that he was hearing things in his head that he was trying to bring out of his horn that the musicians were not able to understand what he was trying to do. So it was very difficult for them to play with him.
When I look back, it seems to me that Bird was so advanced in jazz, I do not think we realized to what degree his ideas had become perfected. Gene Ramey, bass player.
Parker struggled with drug addiction. Something that had gone on for years and became unreliable. He owed money to most of the other band members he worked with, and at times, he wouldn't show up for days.
Jay McShann was a very liberal band leader. He would put up with stuff that other band leaders would not put up with. And, you know, there's some question in my mind as to whether Bird would have ever made it out of Kansas City if it hadn't been for Jay McShann. Jay McShann loved Bird. He would tolerate him. When Bird would goof, he'd say, go crazy. Get it out of your system, come back when you're done.
He struggled with drugs most of his life, something that may have started back in his early days on the road.
On Thanksgiving Day, 1935, Charlie Parker was on his way to a gig at Musser's Ozark Tavern with fellow members of 627. Musser's was located in Eldon, Missouri, about 5 miles south of Eldon, Missouri. And on the way, the car he was riding in hit a slick spot, and it flipped over, rolled over, and it broke his back and his ribs. And it killed George Wilkerson, who was the leader of the date. He was a bass player. And it was a horrible accident. And Charlie came back to Kansas City and recuperated at his mother's house. And the doctor gave him heroin for the pain. And that's where he first developed a taste for narcotics. That's where his addiction really started. He was 16 years old. And he struggled with it the rest of his life.
Parker spent much of his last years in New York, playing with other jazz greats like Dizzy Gillespie and pioneering the bebop sound.
He was definitely a very revolutionary stylist who came on the scene and took the music to a different level from what had been played before.
He died at the age of 34. By that time, he was already considered a legend in jazz.
That young guy found his own voice eventually, but became the genius voice of the world and still is, revered.
There's music before Charlie Parker, and there's music after Charlie Parker. Like Mozart, he changed everything.
Now, another Kansas City sax player is being called the Keeper of the Flame. That that story when Kansas City and All That Jazz continues. In 1997, jazz made a comeback at 18th and Vine. The American Jazz Museum was established, just around the corner from the old headquarters of Local 627. Exhibits inside trace the music that has been part of the city's fabric. The recreation of a jazz club called the Blue Room features musicians performing live 4 nights a week. Along the street, they've created a Jazz Walk of Fame. There, you'll find the names of Basie, Moten, Williams, and Parker. And there's also a more recent name, a star for today's Kansas City legend, Bobby Watson.
Bobby Watson's the keeper of the flame of the Kansas City tradition in so many ways, both as a musician and an educator.
Raised in Bonner Springs in Kansas City, Kansas, Bobby Watson graduated from Miami University with a degree in music composition. He's gone on to play with most of the major jazz artists of today and make more than 100 recordings.
I backed into this music. I like to try to express myself. And when we'd be in concert band, I would always add notes to the parts. I go instead of I go and I'd add stuff because I'd hear it, you know. And the band director would go, Bobby, Watson music. Watson, stop padding the parts. You know, but I just would hear it, I'd have to do it.
He can still hear it. It's not much of a surprise that one of his idols was fellow Kansas City sax player Charlie Parker.
When I heard him, I heard this aura of optimism, triumph over adversity. That's what I heard from Charlie Parker. And besides his amazing virtuosity, which captivated me as a young man trying to learn the instrument.
But Watson has been able to find his own musical voice. He doesn't copy anyone.
He hasn't tried to imitate like Sonny Stitt, people like that. They were trying to imitate Charlie Parker, never could hit those notes, but they were exceptional musicians. But Bobby Watson is a musician that has come to his own music, his own way of expressing himself.
In 2000, Watson came home, convinced to move back from New York to become the director of jazz studies at the UMKC Conservatory of Music. Officially, he is the William and Mary Grant Missouri Endowed Professor of Jazz Studies. But while he's embraced the chance to teach and pass what he knows to the next generation, that doesn't mean he has stopped performing.
As a musician, he travels the world, and he's got the Kansas City stamp. He plays the Kansas City style. He plays it his own way. Great composer, great soloist, but also he's an educator at the Conservatory of Music. And young students from all across the country come here to study with Bobby.
It was sort of a perfect storm coming together, you know, and the young, and the most important thing was our elder statesmen, they embraced them and took them in under their wings. And so they are leading the charge now in this millennium here in Kansas City, and there are people moving to Kansas City, young people, young musicians. They come here and they see what's going on, and they're moving here.
He has found a way to combine his composing and teaching skills. Watson wrote the Gates Barbecue Suite, a musical salute to his hometown. He didn't assemble a national band to record the composition. Instead, he recorded it with the UMKC Jazz Orchestra. And while he plays on the recording, most of it is given over to his students, a sign of just how far he thinks the program has come. Today, Kansas City's jazz scene is growing. Veteran musicians and conservatory students finding new places to perform around town.
Today, Kansas City's jazz scene is vibrant. If you compare the musicians that are working here, the number of clubs, other cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, will come out ahead every time.
Local 627 has merged now with the White Musicians Union, but the building is still operated by the Mutual Musicians Foundation. This building is the thread that binds the generations of jazz together.
Kansas City is one of those crucial components in what is American jazz.
All the great names of Kansas City jazz came here. Now, it's designated as a National Historic Landmark. Pictures of the artists who were members line the walls. A who's who of jazz.
Bus Moten, Julia Lee, Georgie Lee.
Musicians who went on to play not just in Kansas City.
Harlan Leonard, you've got Andy Kirk, Jay McShane, of course.
But in Chicago, New York, Europe, and on countless records.
Dizzy Gillespie's that visited, and Speedy Huggins.
And there may be a new life coming to this old building. The Musicians Foundation has gotten approval for a low-power radio station, playing jazz, of course.
Now, once again, an organic situation is happening. FCC radio station. We raise a new radio station that's going to be inside of Local 627. So even after 100 years, we've gone back to radio. And I think that's incredible.
But its old life still goes on. Every Friday and Saturday night, history comes alive again. There's a jam session going on in this building. Part of a tradition that dates back almost a century.
It's just a historical place, and the people instinctively know to show up on Friday and Saturday night. We don't advertise anything. They just instinctively show up and love to hear the music.
Going down to the foundation back in the day and hanging out till the sun came up. And it was just living the life, you know, stretching.
It starts late, usually about 1 a.m., and lasts until almost dawn.
I'm 77 years old, so I cannot stay up that late, so I very rarely get there. But it's an all-night thing. I have plenty of food and plenty of music.
Music that has a unique Kansas City history and a unique Kansas City sound. Something that shows no signs of stopping.
Musicians still gather at the local 627 Mutual Musicians Foundation at 1 o'clock in the morning on Friday and Saturday and jam as they have since the 1930s. The tradition carries on.
If you'd like to know more about this program and jazz in Kansas City, go to kshb.com/allthatjazz.
Kansas City has maintained that whole 18th and Vine area is very, very important because it represents in a tangible way that people don't have to just try to imagine what it was like. You've got those tangible elements that are there that demonstrate the importance of what Kansas City was all about.
I've always been told, I was told this by Buck O'Neill, if someone came to town looking for a relative, they would be told, you stand on the corner of 18th and Vine, and that person's going to walk by there at some time during the day.
They were really showmen. You know, they dressed very well. They was impeccable in terms of their appearance. Not like they are now. You know, these musicians, they wear almost anything.
I tell our students, if you're going to go out, don't go up on stage on the song you don't know. You know, write the song down, have your little list of songs you want to play. I thought I turned that off. Wait a minute, I think this is the tree person. Hello?
Kansas City as a whole derives its international prominence from 1823 Highland, from the National Historic Landmark known as Local 627. You know, and that's all they know us for. When they get here, they find out about the barbecue.